From polytheism to monotheism, from monotheism to the worship of an abstraction, from the worship of an abstraction to the worship of nothing at all. Such are the several stages in the progressive spiritualization of man's conception of the divine. And perhaps the process may turn out in the end to have been genuinely progressive in a circle or perhaps a spiral. For who knows? The nihilistic atheism into which advancing spirituality is so rapidly leading us may prove to be the introduction, by the way of a most desperate reaction, to a new and more perfect polytheism, itself the symbolical expression of a new and affirmative attitude towards those divinely mysterious forces of life, against which we now so ungratefully blaspheme. But before going further with these speculations about the future and the possible, I must turn aside to say something in the most general terms about the actual history of that monotheism which the Western peoples took over from the Jews. If what Renan says about the sterilization effects of pure monotheism be true, as I think it is, how are we to explain the fact that the races of Europe have not sunk since their conversion to the level of those deplorable Semites, among whom their historian could find no art, no science, no philosophy, no politics, none of those activities, in a word, which justify men in taking a certain pride in their humanity? The tree shall be known by its fruits. Christian Europe has borne good fruits in plenty. Are these the fruits of its monotheism? No. The peoples whom the Jews infected with their monotheism were by long tradition profoundly polytheistic. They lived, moreover, in a world that was not a desert, a world not barren, hard, and dry, but softly alive with the most various richness. They have never, until quite recent times, shown any signs of becoming pure monotheists like their Semitic teachers. Christian orthodoxy itself made a compromise with polytheism. Its one god was mysteriously several gods. It encouraged the worship of a subsidiary female deity. Innumerable saints received their tribute of local adoration, usurped the place once occupied by the Lares and Penates in the home, and provided with their relics an inexhaustible supply of fetishes. In quantity, the Catholic could rival any heathen supply of fetishes. In quantity, the Catholic could rival any heathen pantheon known to history, but not in quality. That was bad, for the saints were drearily lacking in variety. They were all monotonously good. For all their swarming numbers, they represented but one aspect of human life, the spiritual. The Greek and all their other professedly polytheistic systems were much completer, much more realistic. Their pantheons contained representatives of every vital activity, representatives of the body and the instincts as well as of the spirit, of the passionate energies as well as of the reason, of the self-regarding as well as the altruistic tendencies in human nature. True, the Christians did recognize the existence of these other unspiritual aspects of existence, but they handed them over for symbolical embodiment to the devil and his angels. Most of the virtues of the pagans were branded as vices and attributed to the prince of this world. The result of this astonishing policy was the implanting in the modern soul of all that strange and repulsive gamut of peculiarly Christian diseases, from diabolism to conviction of sin, from Puritanism to Don Juanism. What had once been a frank worship of the gods of life degenerated, during the Christian era, into a furtive and self-consciously guilty practice of devil worship. Christianity could not destroy the old Adam, it merely perverted him and made him disgusting. That men with souls so naturaliter non Christianae as the Greeks, the Romans, and later the other peoples of Europe should ever have accepted Jewish monotheism, even in the altered form in which it was offered them by Christianity, may seem surprising. But as it happened, circumstances in the first centuries of our era were extremely propitious for the spread of Semitic dogmas in the West. If gods are made in the image of men, cosmogonies reflect the forms of terrestrial states. In an empire ruled absolutely by one man, the notion of a universe under the control of a single god seemed obvious and reasonable. When the world was divided up into small states ruled by noble oligarchies, the idea was not reasonable nor obvious. The Christian God was a magnified and somewhat flattering portrait of Tiberius and Caligula. Under the Roman Empire, the Western world was unified. The process entailed the destruction, or at least the reduction to insignificant impotence, of all the old nobilities. There was a general leveling down of castes. Under its absolute monarch, the empire was in some sort a democracy. Class distinctions came to depend more and more exclusively on wealth. The best men were the richest. Hereditary aristocracies, heaven knows, are bad enough, but plutocracies are worse. Even degenerate aristocracies preserve a certain decency, but at no time does a plutocracy develop any decency worth preserving. Its Weltan Shuang is uniformly detestable. Plutocrats are believers either in a sordid Smilesian morality, the Puritans, it is significant, were the first modern capitalists, or in a no less sordid self-indulgence, or in both at once. The gospel of work and the gospel of the good time are equally popular in the modern world. A genuine aristocracy would find them equally stupid and disgusting. Among the old aristocracies destroyed by the Roman Empire, polytheism was the traditional religion. The gods were the images of the ruling nobles, projected through the magnifying, the beautifully distorting medium of the imagination on the vault of heaven. The cardinal virtues in these ancient societies were the virtues of a class of masters. The deadly sins, but they were neither deadly nor sins in the Christian sense, but only contemptible defects of mind and body, were the characteristic failings of slaves. With the rise of the empire, the ruling caste slowly withered, freed from the aristocratic tradition, ethic, and beliefs. The slaves now found themselves in a position to express their religious preferences. They chose the religion that told them that they alone were virtuous in this life, and would alone be happy in all men, that preached universal love, and at the same time promised the weak a posthumous vengeance on their masters. In a word, they chose Christianity. What would have happened during the Dark Ages and the succeeding centuries if the religion of Europe had not been monotheistic? We do not know. We find it hard even to imagine. Conceivably, of course, the history of those ages would have been substantially the same as that which is actually recorded in our textbooks. It seems, however, unlikely that I think we are justified in believing that monotheism played an important and, on the whole, beneficial. It seems, however, unlikely, and I think we are justified in believing that monotheism played an important and, on the whole, beneficent part during those ages, first of obscure tumult and then of piecemeal order. The monotheistic idea, with which were inextricably twined the Catholic and imperial ideas, acted as a brake on those disruptive and centrifugal forces which might, but for it, have kept all Europe in a state of fragmentary chaos. Christianity, the preacher of monotheism, was valuable, but no less valuable, it should be remembered, was Christianity, the preserver of the old polytheistic culture. The Renaissance was a revival of the polytheistic spirit. The parallel Reformation was a revival of pure Semitism. The Reformers read their Old Testaments, and trying to imitate the Jews became those detestable Puritans to whom we owe not merely Grundyism and Podsnappery, but also, as Weber and Tawney have shown in their studies of economic history, all that was and still is vilest, cruelest, most ruthlessly anti-human in the modern capitalist system. To their one Jewish God, good Calvinists and independents sacrificed almost everything that could make a man prouder of being a man than a termite or a perfectly efficient automation. The Reformers took monotheism very seriously. A little later, the triumphs of physical science led to its being taken no less seriously on other than religious grounds. Voltaire, for example, was an ardent monotheist, not because he wanted to be like the Jews, but because Sir Isaac Newton had successfully formulated in terms of mathematics a number of apparently changeless laws of nature. The physicists, it seemed, had seen through the illusion of diversity. The world was one, and with it, the world's creator. The contemporary circumstances are even more propitious to the spread of monotheism than were those of the Roman Empire. What the imperial administration did for the Mediterranean basin and the Western Europe, commerce and good communications, cheap printing, and elementary education for all, the cinema and the radio have done for the world at large. In spite of national antagonisms, we are aware of a certain planetary unity. It is a unity at present merely of economic interest, and perhaps it will never be more than that. To me, at any rate, it seems in the highest degree unlikely that mankind will ever feel itself intimately and livingly one. The differences of race and place are too enormous. there is such a thing as absolute alienness, and absolute alienness, which no amount of Esperanto and international government, of motives and 1,000 miles an hour aeroplanes and standardized education will ever, it seems to me, completely abolish. Meanwhile, however, economic unity exists, and men are aware of their common interest, just as under the Romans they were aware of their common servitude to a single master. The social circumstances are propitious to monotheism, but propitious circumstances are not creative, only fertilizing. There must be a psychological seed for the circumstances to be propitious to. In our contemporary world, what is the seed of monotheism? For a section of the modern slave population, Christianity is still the introduction to monotheism, but only for a section. Most slaves at the present time are not Christian at all. They are either too well off to feel the need of a consolatory faith, witness and the transformation of Christianity in America from a religion predominantly concerned with other worldly virtues and posthumous revenges into a system for the justification of wealth and the preaching of industrious respectability from a system that condemned the Pharisee, that shining example of good citizenship, into one that exalts the Pharisee above every other human type. Either, I repeat, they are too prosperous to be Christians, or else, if they are badly off and disconnected, they turn to one of the political surrogates of Christianity and find in communism and dreams of terrestrial utopias a comforting prospect of happiness for themselves and condign punishment for their enemies. Contemporary monotheism, that vague and secular doctrine of the divine unity, which is now taken for granted as a sort of axiomatic truism, has its main psychological source in what, for lack of a better name, may be called our intellectualism. Not that we are all intellectuals nowadays, far from it, but still less are we all predominantly instinctive, passional, intuitive beings. We are members of a very highly organized society, in which it pays best to be either a man who understands the unremittingly wills, or else a kind of obedient automation. Inevitably, for the more complicated the social machine, the more inhumanly and mechanically simple becomes the task of the subordinate individual, the more inhumanly difficult that of the commanding organizer. Those who wish to lead a quiet life in our modern world must be like Babbitt, unquestioningly a cog. Those who are ambitious to lead a, but by current standards, successful life must be like Ford, determined and very consciously intelligent. Those who would lead a thoroughly disastrous life have only to model themselves on the pattern, shall we say, of such complete and harmonious beings as Burns and William Blake. Triumphant science enhances the already enormous prestige of will-directed intelligence. The most ignorant member of the modern slave population would probably agree with Aristotle that the pursuit of knowledge is the highest duty, and that the only permissible excesses are excesses of the intellect. The intellectual scientific knowledge of things which we now esteem so highly is a knowledge of the unity which underlies, at any rate in our minds, the manifold diversity of the world. Direct living knowledge of diversity is not, by social and scientific standards, useful knowledge. There is also a direct intuitive knowledge of unity, but it comes to us but rarely. At most times, and by most people, unity is apprehended after the fact by the abstracting intellect. For practical and scientific purposes, the direct or mystical knowledge of unity is as useless as the direct knowledge of diversity. The value of direct knowledge, as I shall try to show later on, consists in the fact that it is a stimulator, a nourisher of life. Between the two kinds of knowledge, the direct physical knowledge, whether of diversity or of unity, and of the intellectual knowledge, abstracted and generalized out of this physical knowledge, is a difference analogous to that between food and an instrument. Knives and hammers are indispensable, but so to an even higher degree is bread. Our present tendency is to overrule the instrument and to undervalue the food, which alone can give us the vital power and health to use the instrument properly. Contemporary monotheism is an expression of our excessive love for that abstract knowledge of the general and the uniform, which enables us to explain and predict and organize and do many other useful things, but gives us, alas, no substance by which we may live. My theme so far has been monotheism as truth or falsehood, and monotheism as a historical fact. The time has now come to consider the rights and wrongs of monotheism, its usefulness, or the reverse, its conformity or non-conformity to the facts of human nature. Of monotheism's conformity to the psychological facts, of its inward as opposed to its outward truth, I have already said something. Let me recapitulate in a rather different key. We can affirm that the universe, with its divinity, is one, founding our belief on the fact that we have had a direct experience of its unity. But in this case, we must ignore all the much more numerous occasions when we have had a direct experience of its diversity. True, the mystics are never tired of affirming that their direct perception of unity is intenser, of finer quality, and intrinsically more convincing, more self-evident than their direct perceptions of diversity. But they can speak only for themselves. Other people's direct intuitions of diverse appearances may be just as intensely self-evident as their intuition of unique reality. Not only may be, but evidently are. That is, if we can judge by the artistic statements of their experiences made by talented unity perceivers and talented diversity perceivers, respectively. And we have no other means of judging. The final mystery is unknowable. Men's confused perceptions of it are diverse and contradictory. The truth, the inward truth, I mean, since that is the only truth we can know, is that God is different for different men and for the same man on different occasions. The testimony of the mystics cannot be made to prove more than this, nor can that of the discursive reasoners. For if we arrive at our notion of divine unity by a process of discursive reasoning, after the event we find ourselves forced to affirm that one psychological fact, in this case of an intellectual kind, is truer than another of a sensuous kind, an assumption for which, as we have already seen, there is no justification, but which has nevertheless been made by many philosophers, from Plato onwards and downwards. Psychological fact is as good as another. There is no conceivable method of demonstrating that God is either one or many. So far as human beings are concerned, he is both. Monotheism and polytheism are equally true, but are they equally useful? Do they tend equally to the quickening and enhancement of human life? Let us put the questions in more general, more fundamental psychological terms. Monotheism and polytheism are more or less systematic rationalizations of a sentiment of our own and the world's unity and a sentiment of our own and the world's diversity, respectively. Which is the more valuable for life? The unity feeling with its various religious or philosophical rationalizations, or the diversity feeling with its attendant doctrines? Men are also citizens. There are no Crusoes. In a highly organized society, however, the citizens are apt to forget that they are also men. They come to value themselves and their fellows for what they can do in a socially useful way, as personified functions rather than as human beings. They admire those who are well provided with that kind of knowledge, which I have called instrumental. For those who have grown strong on the knowledge that is life's nourishment, they have no particular respect. On the contrary, they often despise and at the same time mistrust and fear them. Files and screwdrivers are not the most satisfactory articles of diet. Analogously, there is no physical nourishment to be drawn from the abstract instrumental knowledge so much appreciated in a society like our own. Souls are nourished only by a direct participative knowledge of things, by an immediate physical contact, by a relationship involving will, desire, feeling. Direct participative knowledge is mostly a knowledge of diversity. Nace te ipsum. The commandment can only be obeyed on condition that we participatively know the multiple world, for it is essentially the same with the mind as with the body. These fields of potatoes and cabbages, these browsing sheep and oxen are potentially a part of me, and unless they actually become part of me, I die. The apparent boundaries of any real being are not its real boundaries. We all think we know what a lion is. A lion is a desert-colored animal with a mane and claws and an expression like Garibaldi's. But it is also, in Africa, all the neighboring antelopes and zebras, and therefore indirectly all the neighboring grass. It is also behind the menagerie bars, all the superannuated horses that come into the local market. In the same way, a human spirit is all that it can experience. The whole experienceable world is potentially a part of it, just as the whole edible or otherwise physically assimilable world is a part potentially of the body. Assimilable. But the body remains, for all practical purposes, the same, whatever within limits the food that nourishes it. The spirit, on the other hand, can be profoundly modified by that which it assimilates. Changes which, if they happened to the body, would be miraculous, are everyday occurrences in the world of the spirit. No man can know himself completely, for the good reason that no man can have had all possible experiences, and therefore can never have realized all the potentialities of his being. If the supply of game runs low, the king of beasts grows thin and mangy. It ceases altogether, and he dies. So with the soul. Its principal food is the direct and physical experience of diversity. Certainly, deliberately reduce the food. The philosopher's soul withdraws itself as far as it can from all association and contact with the body, and reaches out after truth by itself. With that results? With what results? Deprived of its nourishment, the soul grows thin and mangy, like the starved lion. The ascetics go even farther than the philosophers. They starve their souls to death, or in more orthodox language, detach themselves completely from all earthly things, ceasing to perceive, to think, to feel, to desire, to act. The more mystical among them fall into that state of ecstatic coma, when the blank and empty spirit is said to be united with the infinite. In other words, when it has ceased to be alive. The more practical ascetics, reformers, or reactionary soldiers of the church militant galvanize their death into a gruesome activity with the stimulus of some monomaniacal principle, some insanely fixed idea. Philosophers and ascetics are not, of course, the only people who commit self-murder. The money grubber, the hard-headed businessman, the routine worker pass their existence no less suicidally. The professional Don Juan destroys his spirit as fatally as does the professional ascetic, whose looking-glass image he is. To live, the soul must be in intimate contact with the world, must assimilate it through all the channels of sense and desire, thought and feeling, which nature has provided for the purpose. Anything which obstructs these channels injures the soul. Any deadening routine, any dull habitual unawareness, any exclusive monomania, whether of vice or of that other vice which is excessive virtue. Close up enough of these channels, cut off enough of its nourishment, and the starved soul dies. Dead souls, like dead bodies, either shrivel up into dry and dusty mummies, or else decaying they stink. What an unbearable stench arises, for example, from the Thebaid. 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 One must hold one's nose when one reads Palladius's history. Calvin's Geneva is another open sewer. So is the Paris of de Nerciat's Felicia. So are Podsnap's London and Babbitt's Zenith. Other dead souls do not damply rot, but wither almost aromatically into desiccation. But I, for one, prefer the moist, still earthly perfume of the flowers on the growing plant that has its roots deep sunk and darkly living in the soil. Life, then, individual life, is mainly nourished by the direct, participative knowledge of the world's diversity. Out of that diversity, and out of the inner diversity of the human spirit, the poetic imagination of man extracts the deities of polytheism, and the rites of their worship are man's participative knowledge and man's emotional reactions to the world, systematized in a set of words and gestures. The ritual of Catholicism is an incomplete version of polytheistic ritual. Incomplete because it systematizes only a part of man's emotional reactions to the world, because it ignores or brands as evil certain kinds of participative knowledge of certain whole classes of things. Every every diagnesiac reaction to the world, every corybantic participation of individual energies with the energies of living nature has been proscribed. The Catholic ritual canalizes only a part of the human responses to the universe, just as the Christian God symbolically represents only a part of the psychological and cosmic reality. The intuitive or intellectual realization of cosmic unity, the religious and philosophical systems which impose this cosmic unity as a necessary dogma, possesses for man a predominantly social and scientific value. Without some unifying hypotheses, without generalizations, the abstractions organized knowledge is impossible. Social relations would be equally impossible if men did not believe in some sort of community of tribal, national, and finally human interest, or were without a conception of their own psychological unity and that of their fellows. The gods symbolize and at the same time confirm the community of their worshippers' interests. The conception of the individual soul, single, persistent, and responsible, is at once an expression and a guarantee of man's individual and social morality. Monotheism and polytheism are doctrines equally necessary and equally true. Man can and does conceive of himself and of the world as being now essentially many and now essentially one. Therefore, since God, for our human purposes, is simply life in so far as man can conceive it as a whole, the divine is both one and many. A purely monotheistic religion is thus seen to be inadequate and unrealistic. The The present age is predominantly monotheistic. Monotheistic either because it feebly believes in a decaying Christianity, or else secularly and irreligiously monotheistic with the Unitarianism of science, of democracy, of international capitalism. In the interest of the man, as opposed to the citizen, and incidentally, in the interest of the citizen too, for you cannot ruin the individual without, in the long run, ruining society, it has become necessary to protest against this now pernicious doctrine. Christian monotheism and spirituality prepared the way for our intellectualism and machine worship by rendering disreputable all that in human nature is not mind, not spirit, not conscious will. The established religion decayed, but the philosophical and ethical habits which it had generated molderingly persisted and persist. The high-minded man who would, in the past, have been an earnest Christian is now what? Not an earnest, or preferably light-hearted, pagan, but an earnest intellectual, living aesthetically for knowledge. And the low-minded man? He is no ascetic, of course, and his goal is not knowledge, but money, comfort, and a good time. The intellectual despises him for living grossly on the plane of the body. The contempt is justified because he lives so inadequately and poor on the plane. If he lived well, there he would be a much better man than the intellectual, lacking all religious significance. His physical and instinctive life is pointless and rather dirty. It is also lamentably incomplete. By deconsecrating his body and the diverse world with which it participatively communicates through the instincts, feelings, and desires, by robbing them of their divine meaning, Christianity has left him without defense against our mechanized civilization. Rationalized division of labor takes all the sense out of his work. Machines relieve him not merely of drudgery, but of the possibility of performing any creative or spontaneous act whatsoever. And this is now true of his leisure as well as his labor. He has almost ceased even to try to divert himself, but sits and suffers the standardized entertainment to trickle over his passive consciousness. By men with a religious sense of life's divineness, the inroads of this civilization would have been bitterly resented and stubbornly resisted. Not by Christians, however. Christianity had taught that the worship of any aspect of life but the spiritual was a sin. Good pagans might have found a satisfactory method of dealing with the problems raised by the coming of the machine. Good Christians could hardly see that there were any problems to solve. Passively, they accepted the evil thing. The chief result of the preaching of Christian spirituality and of its later substitute, scientific intellectualism, is that men now instinctively and enthusiastically love the lowest when they see it. The apostles labored, the martyrs died in torment, the philosophers thought sublime thoughts. By precept and example, the scholars and the men of science proclaimed the beauties of the higher life, and all agreed that God is one, and the Spirit, and that man's first duty is to resemble God. To what end? That men might become purer, they would have answered, better more than men. But what has actually occurred? Trying to live superhumanly, men have sunk in all but the purely mental sphere, towards a kind of subhumanity, that it would be an undeserved compliment to call bestial. Turned against life, they have worshipped death in the form of spirituality and intellectualism. Deprived of the support of life's divinities, they have succumbed to the shoddy temptations of the devil, of the machine. By exhorting men to lead the higher life, Christianity and its philosophical successors have condemned men to an existence incomparably lower than that low life against which they have always fulminated. To their cry of Excelsior, humanity has responded in the very nature of things. It could not do otherwise, by rushing down a steep place into what? We who are only part way down the Gadarene water chute are not as yet in a position to answer. The gulf lies dark before us. If men are ever to rise again from the depths into which they are now descending, it will only be with the aid of a new religion of life. And since life is diverse, the new religion will have to have many gods. Many, but since the individual man is a unity in his various multiplicity, also one. It will have to be Dionysian and Panic as well as Apollonian, Orphic as well as rational, not only Christian, but martial and Venerian too, Phallic as well as Minervian or Jehovinistic. It will have to be all, in a word, that human life actually is, not merely the symbolical expression of one of its aspects. Meanwhile, however, the Gadarene descent continues. Do what you will. 1929.